Today's daf is daf Kuf Vav, and we begin the 13th parak of Zevachim with the Mishnah here that deals with two prohibitions. One prohibition is shchita bachutz, when you have kodshim and you shecht it outside the azara, and for that you get kares if you did it b'mezid, and you bring a karban chatos if you did it b'shogeg, you didn't realize it was prohibited, or you didn't realize it was kodshim. Maybe you didn't know that you're not allowed to shecht it outside the Azara. And then we have another Isur called Halas Chutz, which means that he took the basar of the carbon and he burnt it on an altar. He created some sort of a mizbeach, a makeshift mizbeach, so to speak, outside of the Beis Hamikdash. And once again, if he does that b'mezid, the Torah says he's chayav kares. We'll see where we derive this from in the psukim. And if he does a peshogeg, he's chayav achatos. And the Mishnah is going to address the following issue: what happens if he does both? He does shchutei chutz and halas chutz. Now, normally the halacha is that if you violate a chiyuv kares twice without any idea in the middle, meaning you didn't realize between one and the other that you had violated an isur, that's called behelim achas. Then he brings one carbon and he kills two birds with one stone because he repeated the same avera twice. So, for example, let's say he would eat a kazayis chelev, b'shogeg, and then again, without realizing about the first achila, he went ahead and he ate another second kazayis chelev, and this is all behelim achas. He brings only one carbon. However, if he eats, let's say, a kazayis chelev, and then he eats a kazayis of dam, then he brings two chatos, because they're two different shemos, two different categories of Isur. Now, what happens if behelim achas, he shechts the carbon outside the azara, and then he burns it on a mizbeach outside the azara? Should we say that he's chayav twice because he violated two separate independent isurim, or would one chatos be fine for both? So we look at the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, "Ashochet v'amala b'chutz." He did both, shchita and halah b'chutz. Chayav ala shchita v'chayav ala halah. According to Tanakama, the first view, he's going to be chayav shtayim. He has to bring two chatos because he violated two independent isurim. However, Rabbi Yossi Aglili Omer, shachat bifnim, it's not always the case that he'll be chayav shtayim. If, let's say, he had a proper shchita inside the azara, vehela b'chutz, and then he violated the halah by taking the basar of the carbon outside of the azara and burnt it there on an altar, chayav. But shachat b'chutz, vehela b'chutz, in your case, Rabbi Yosef Gli turns to the Chachamim, in the scenario in which he did both shchita b'chutz and halah b'chutz, potter. He's only chayav for the shchita, but he's not going to be chayav an additional carbon for violating halah. Why? Shlo hela ela davar apostle. When the Torah prohibits halah, it says that you have to bring the carbon el pesach o el moed, which means that the carbon is kosher, and instead you went ahead and you burnt it on an altar outside the azara. However, in this case, when he shechted bachutz, then the moment he took the animal outside of the azara, the carbon is possible, and therefore you cannot apply the chiyuv halah because it's not el pesach ol moed. It's not roy to be brought on the mizbeach. Amru lo, the chachamim responded, af hashochi b'fnim umala bachutz. Wait a second. So, in what case do you, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, admit that he's chayav shtayim? That's in a case where, I'm sorry. In what case do you agree that he's chayav halah b'chutz? That's where he did a proper shchita inside. and then he burnt the carbon on an altar outside, is Kavan Shotzio, the very moment that he took the carbon outside of the location of the Azara at that moment in time, solo. And yet you don't deny that if he now does halal, your point, Rabbi Yosef, it was only if he did the shchita b'chutz and the halal b'chutz, because once he did the shchita b'chutz, it's possible he cannot no longer be chayv halal. But the Rabbanan argue against Rabbi Yosef, and they say, wait a minute, even if he did the shchita b'fnim, which is a shchita kshera, the very moment he took it outside, at that split second, the carbon became possible. And now it's no longer royal Pesach or Moed. How could he be chayv halal? You, Rav Yosef, clearly concede that he's chayv halal in the case where he did the shchita bifnim and it was a valid shchita, but the very moment he took it outside, it became possible. And according to your logic, once it becomes possible, he can't be chayv halal. So in effect, you've reduced the chiyuv halal to a non-set. It's a null set. It doesn't exist. Now the Mishnah gives a parallel machlokas between, again, the same Tanakama and Rabbi Yosef Glili in the case of Tomei. The Torah says that if a gavra, person is Tomei, and he eats kodshim, and we'll see there's going to be machlokas now between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yosef Glili in a case where the kodshim themselves were Tomei. But let's talk about a simple case. The kodshim were tahar, the gavra is Tomei, he contracted or contaminated himself with the tumah, and now he went ahead and he ate kodshim tahorim. So the Mishnah first quotes the Tanakama, hatame, a person who's tame, sha'achal, and it doesn't matter, it says kind of bein kodesh tame, bein kodesh tar. Even if he, as a tame, eats kodshim tmeim, chayev, he's going to be chayev achatos either way. Because if a Tomei eats kodshim, then he's chayav kares b'mezid and a chatos b'shogeg. And the Chacham argue that it matters not whether or not the kodshim themselves were tmeim or not, but Rabbi Yosef Glili Omer, he disagrees. Tomei shachol tar chayav. Only in the case where he was Tomei, the kodshim were tahorim, and now he contaminated the kodshim by eating them. Then he's chayev. However, tomei sha'achal tomei potter shloachal adover tomei. I mean, he really didn't change anything. The kodshim were already tomei. He's tomei. Now he eats it. Nothing really went on over here of serious effect, and therefore he's potter. Amrulo, the Chacham say, according to your logic, then let's go one step further. Af tomei sha'achal satar. What about the case that you agree, Rabbi Yosef Glili, he's chayev a chatos and kares b'mezid, namely when the Tomei ate kodshim tahorim? Well, a Tomei is metame b'maga. In other words, the very moment that he lifted up the kodshim, the contamination of tumah now is transferred over to the kodshim. The kodshim became tameim. Now when he puts it into his mouth and he eats it, he's basically a Tomei who's eating kodshim tameim. Kevan shenagabo timu. So how, Rav Yosef Glili, can you logically argue that you're only chayiv in a case where a tomei eats tar? Well, the very moment he comes in contact with it, it's already became tomei, and he's no longer a tomei eating tar, he's a tomei eating tomei, which you say he's potter. Once again, reducing this case of a tomei to a null set. And the Gemara is going to try to defend Rav Yosef Glili against all these arguments. Now we finish the Mishnah. Vitar sha'achal tamei. Until now we've been talking about the gavra was tamei, and he's not allowed to eat kodshim. What about a case where the gavra is tar, but the kodshim are tmeim? Tar sha'achal tamei. The gavra himself is tar, but the kodshim are tmeim. That's also a violation. But that's only a lav. That's a separate lav in the Torah, a lotaseh. But the Torah doesn't impose a chiv kares, and therefore patur. If he did it b'shogeg, he's off the hook. He doesn't even have to bring a chatas. She'einu chayv al tumas haguf. The chiv kares only applies when the gavra is tummy. But if the gavra is tar and he eats kodshim tmeim, which he's not allowed to eat, he violates a law, but it's not a chiyuv kares. Hence, if he did it b'shogeg, he's pot. Gemara asks the following question: Bishlei mahal, in order to generate a chiyuv kares, or for that matter, any punishment whatsoever, you need two things. You need what's called an azara, which means where the Torah says do not do X. And you need an onesh, in which the Torah spells it out, that if you violate X, you'll be chayav the following punishment. So the Gemara now makes a distinction between halah, which we said was burning the kodshim outside the azara on an altar. Here we have both an azhara, a do not, and an onesh. But in the case of shchita, we're going to have a lot of problems. Bishlei mahalah ksiv onesh uksiv azhara. We have both the punishment and the lotas. Why? Onesh tichsiv, the Torah says, vel pesach ol moed lo heviu, and the end of the pasuk says v'nichrasa me'ameha. So the Torah says that if he didn't bring the carbon into the azara, then he's chayav kares. So that's the onesh. Azhar dichsiv hisham lecha pentalo lasecha. Now here the Torah doesn't say lotas said don't be mala your ola outside the mikdash, but rather it says hisham lecha. But ki hadi amr of ovin amr of Allah. So a very famous statement called makom shedemer hishamer, pen or al. Any of these three lashonos will substitute for lo, and they become a lotas. And of course the Gemara is assuming, and this is a fundamental underlying principle in the whole sugya, that in order to be chayav an onesh, you have to violate a lav, a lotas. So we always have to find the lotas. And indeed, when the Torah says, as far as the violation of Allah is concerned, that he's chayav kares, there is a lotas. It says, he shomer lecha pentala olasecha. B'chol makom shetira, it's any place that you decide you want to burn the carbon. So the Torah says yechayiv kares. Ela shchita. But now we get to the other iser that is addressed in our Mishnah, namely shchutei chutz, where he shechts the carbon outside the azar. Bishlema onish tichsiv. There's another pasuk in that same Perek, which is Perek Yud Zayin in Vayikra. It says El Pesach Ol Moed Lo Vio, and this additional Lo Vio, as opposed to the previous pasuk, which is a little bit earlier. No, I'm sorry, which is a little bit later. Anyway, that pasuk says Lo Hevi Enu. That pasuk is referring to halah b'chutz, but this pasuk lo havio is referring to shchita b'chutz, and the Torah says that he's chayiv kares. El azhar minolan, but where's the lotas said that prohibits shchutei chutz? So the Gemara tries to utilize a pasuk which appears in that same chapter in Vayikra Yud Zayin, but in a slightly different context. Omar Kra, the Torah says, "Well, yizbechu od," and it means literally don't add a shchita. But at any rate, the word yizbechu is a synonymous word with shchita, and here it says velo, which is a lo taseh, and the Gemara is assuming that od here don't shecht it beyond, meaning beyond the azara, the temple azara. So the Gemara is going to try to argue now in a few different ways. We're going to start with number one, Rebbe Lazar, that we need this pasuk vel yizbechu od for a different context entirely. In the case of Rebbe Lazar, we need it for avodah zarah. Haini boile lich Rabbi Lazar. You can't use this pasuk vel yizbechu od for an iser of shchutei chutz, a lav, because I need it for a different prohibition, namely minayin l'zover peimel ha'kulashu chayav. Now we're talking about an animal that he's slaughtering for the sake of avodah zarah. But it's a case of markulis. Now, markulis Oh, let me just give one introduction. In Avodah Zarah, there's something called Kedarko, which means this is the way that the idol worshippers worship their idol. And normally speaking, the way they worship their idol is by bowing to their idol, by slaughtering something in front of their idol. They do it in a derech kavod, in a respectful, reverent way. But there's some avodos kochavim, some idolatries, which, to our surprise, they do something degrading to the idol or in front of the idol, and that's the way they normally worship their idol. Like there's something called Paratzmo Kepe'er, we won't go into the gory details. And then there's something called Markolis. Markolis is where they throw stones in front of the idol. It's degrading. What happens if he does a reverent act for the sake of Markolis? So it's the unusual way of worshiping Markolis, but yet it's reverent. He bows down to Markolis, he shechts an animal for the sake of Markolis. And Rebbe Loza is going to derive that you're chayav for such a case, where it's shalom kedarko, but it's derech kavod in Avodah Zarah, from this very pasuk, t'chsiv lo yizbechu odes zivcheim, which means he doesn't do it in the way that they do it. Right? Let's read the pasuk. He shall not slaughter their sacrifices in the way that they stray. In other words, this pasuk is coming to add a new prohibition and expanding the prohibition of Avodah Zarah. We're not talking about a case where he did worship it the exact way that the idol worshippers would worship it, because that we already have in a pasuk. In other words, this is the way that they serve their deities. So now we have the extra pasuk Yizbchu Odes Ivcheim, which is totally superfluous. It must be that the Torah is saying od, meaning an additional zvicha, which is a zvicha of shchita in front of Markolis, which is shalom kedarka. That's not the normal way that they worship the deity called Markolis. So at this point, the Gemara now is hard pressed. How do we know that there's an Isur Lav in the Torah of shchutei chutz when the pasuk that v'lo yizbechu od that you wanted to access is necessary to teach me a category in Avodah Zarah of Shelo Kedarka? Omar Rabba says that this pasuk V'lo Yizbechu Od can teach us two different isurim: Kari Be V'lo Yizbechu and Kari Le V'lo Od. In other words, you read the beginning of the pasuk and you use that beginning of the pasuk for both the end of the pasuk. So use it basically twice. So we're going to read it Lo Yizbechu, and that's referring to shechting a korban outside the Azara. And then V'kari V'lo Od, and we're going to read it Lo Yizbechu V'lo Od. So we're going to read it again with the extra words V'lo Od, as Lo Yizbechu, don't slaughter an animal, even though that's not the normal way that the idol worshippers would worship their animal. So according to Rabbah, we have a valid source for the lav, the lotas said, that prohibits shchutei chutz. The Gemara is not happy with it. Akati, this is round number 2, we still need the pasuk lo yizbechu od to derive a different prohibition. Akati, nevertheless, miboile, we need this pasuk lo yizbechu od lichidesanya for that which we learned in a brisa. Ad kan hu medaber v'kodshim shekedishon b'shas isra bomos, v'krivim b'shas isra bomos. We have periods in Jewish history where you are permitted to set up your own private altar in your backyard and bring your korbanos. That's going to be the whole last part of Maseches Zevachim about the bomos. And those periods of time were periods of time where there was no Mishkan, there was no Migdash. Like, for example, the Mishkan moved from place to place. During certain periods, it was in Nov, it was in Givon, it was in Shiloh, it was in many, many different places. When the Mishkan was set up in a certain place, then bomos became prohibited, because it's like the Torah says, bring your korban in the Mishkan. You can't bring it outside the Mishkan. But there were periods of time in Jewish history in between one Mishkan and another. And there was no Mishkan at that time till they set it up. And that time there was a heter bamos. Like, for example, when the Jewish people crossed the Jordan with Yoshua, at that point, the Mishkan was not yet set up. So there would be a heter, a permissibility of bamos. Now, to be chayev for shechting on a bama during a period of time of Iser bamos, which is again the vast majority of Jewish history. As a fact, after Shlomo Melech built the first Mikdash, from then on there was never, and there never will be a heter bamos. That's gone. That's history. But that is only one half of the equation. The fact that he brought the carbon is half of the equation. The other half of the equation is the Hakdasha, which means when he was Magdish the carbon. And the Gemara now is raising the following possibility: you're only chayav for chutz, you're only chayav for shechting and bringing a carbon on a bama if the Hakdasha took place during the time of Iser Bamos. So during the time of Iser Bamos, he did two things. He was Magdish an animal, and he brought it outside of the Mishkan. But now, what's the deal if the Hakdasha was done during a period of time where there was a heter bamos? So let's say at time T1, the Mishkan had not yet been established in Nov, Gimon, etc., and he was Magdish an animal. So at that point, the animal was roy, it was fit to be brought in the Mishkan. Then the Mishkan was destroyed, and he brought it. No, I'm sorry, starting again. And then the Mishkan was established, not destroyed, right? So again, when the Hakdash, there was no Mishkan at the time of the Hakdasha, but subsequent to the Hakdasha, the Mishkan was established, which generated an Isur of Hakrova B'Bama, and he went ahead and he was Makriv B'Bama. So only half of the violation was implemented, because as far as the Hakdasha is concerned, he had every right to do the Hakdasha for the purpose of bringing it chutz, because at that point there was no Mishkan.